Alright, so this is the tiny PC that I built myself a few months ago. It's actually my personal editing and gaming system, and it's been absolutely insane. It's got an RTX 4090 and a Ryzen 5800X 3D. At least it did, because now it is completely empty. And the reason for that is because today we're making it even more powerful and also finally preparing this thing for liquid cooling. Remember that insanely small 4090 water block that we tested out? Well, this is where we're putting it. Now, the first thing that we're going to be upgrading is the CPU. And this build previously used a Ryzen 5800X 3D, and you guys already know I absolutely love this CPU. If it wasn't for content, I would probably still use it. It's like just one of the best. It feels like one of the first CPUs in a long time where you actually get top tier gaming performance without having to crank up the power to ridiculous amounts. However, since this build is going to be, just completely over the top, it only makes sense that we switch to the new stuff while we have the opportunity. So enter Ryzen 7000. So look, we're not getting monumental gains here in terms of gaming performance, but these are more efficient than Ryzen 5000. And if we're going to be hooking this thing up to the same loop as a 4090 in an ITX case, I want to be saving as much power and heat load as possible. Even saving 20 watts, 30 watts, that could be a few degrees on our GPU. So here we're going with the new 7800X 3D, which just came out. Gaming performance looks to be about even with the more expensive 7950X 3D. In fact, it's even faster in some scenarios. With the 7800X 3D, it's just a straight 8 cores, single CCD, every core has access to that extra L3 cache, and it just makes more sense. And another thing that I've noticed with Ryzen 5000 coming from my 12900K system is that it just doesn't pair as well with gaming mice that have higher polling rates, so 4000 Hz, 8000 Hz especially. Just notice higher CPU usage, FPS drops, frame time spikes and stuff like that. It's not super serious, I can get by with say 2000 Hz quite fine, but hopefully, Ryzen 7000 is an improvement in this area as well. Of course, we do need a new motherboard to plug this into, and we're upgrading to probably the most stacked ITX board that I've ever used, and that's the Asus X670i Strix. One of those boards where they just straight up run out of PCB space, so they start building vertically instead. You've got this additional breakout here for the front panel connector, SATA, and USB, and then flipping over to the rear, you've just got the most jacked rear I/O that you'll ever find on ITX. In fact, I count 10 USB ports, 2 of them being USB 4 Type-C. This board does also have 2 of those small onboard fans, which some people are not a big fan of. One is for the chipset and M.2 stack at the bottom, and the other is for the VRM. However, these both can be controlled, configured, and completely disabled. Also pretty rare to see, but it's definitely nice, are that 2-pin temperature sensor at the bottom, which we will be using to monitor the temperature of our coolant. Now, as for things like BIOS flashback, audio ports, the usual things that you'd find on a rear I/O, you'll actually find those on this thing right here. You plug it into the rear USB and it gives you those extra features if and when you need them. And I mean, if you don't have a separate audio interface or volume control, this is actually pretty damn cool. The volume dial and extra USB port at least is a nice to have for those simpler setups. And since we're on a DDR5 platform now, I'll be switching to this kit here from G.Skill. It's 32 gigs, 6800 megahertz, CL34. It's honestly nothing too crazy, but I will be doing some mild tuning to this to see what we can squeeze out of it. Now, something that I did not expect to be upgrading was the 4TB M.2 drive that I bought for the initial build. I need that extra space. I've been filming longer videos. I've been working on, multiple projects at a time. It was really nice to have that extra capacity at first, but man, after using it a couple of times, I realized that I just made the wrong choice. The specific drive I bought was the Crucial P3, and I mean, the sustained write speeds of this thing just fall off a cliff if you're transferring really large amounts of data, which is something I do a lot of. So for gamers, I still think it's okay. It's definitely a decent value pick if you need like a massive game library or something like that, but for video editors, definitely steer clear. I'll be replacing this thing with the WD Black SN850X, which is also 4TB, but a lot more expensive. And after comparing the specs, this should give me the sustained write performance that I'm after. All right, but this next part though is super sick. This is the Mod Ultra Lobo, and it is the lowest profile CPU pump block on the market. Even with a heatsink and a DDC pump on top of this thing, it is just 45 millimeters tall. That actually makes it smaller than the tiny air cooling heatsink that we were using in this build initially. And I've got to say, the quality on this thing is just ridiculous. Like, the cooling elements, of course, are just pure copper, but everything else is cerakoted brass and aluminium. So yeah, it's literally a ceramic coated and CNC'd housing. And yeah, I've got to tell you, it feels amazing in the hands, just doesn't really get higher quality than this. And here's a size comparison to the EK version of the same product, which I'm also a big fan of. The reservoir on that thing is massive and the port versatility is a lot better, but we do save about 15 millimeters in height. And effectively for this build, that means that we gain that clearance for one of our radiators, which should mean extra airflow. Now the cooling performance of course remains to be seen, but I mean, if it's anything like the quality and feel of the product and the effort that they've put into that, then I'm guessing there won't be any problems. So this for sure has to be one of the most dense ITX builds that I've ever done. I mean, it's more dense than the N case, it's more dense than the triple rad NR200 that I've built, and so the clearances between all of the parts are extremely slim. I mean, at least when we get that second radiator in there, it's just going to be absolutely insane. Something that I did here, which I don't usually do, even for super compact builds like this, is a set of completely custom cables. So here is the stock 24-pin cable that comes with the Corsair SF750. You know, it's not bad, it's a nice sleeved cable, but here is the custom one that I'll be using instead. So yeah, size difference, absolutely insane. With this custom one, it basically means that we don't have to fold the original cable or route it longer than we need to. In fact, the way that I made this custom 24-pin was by actually inserting the empty plugs and just by measuring the minimum distance for each wire. So that way we kind of get the shortest cable possible. I used the original cable as a reference for the pinout and just hand measured each wire one by one. And I know it's not sleeved or anything fancy like that, you know, there's no cable combs or anything, but I actually love the clean kind of factory look that it gives. In a way, it actually looks more stock than the cable that the power supply ships with. I also made a custom 8-pin for the CPU, and similar approach to this one, there's no sleeving and it basically is as short as possible, but the way that I've routed it underneath the top radiator, the cable becomes completely hidden. So yeah, pretty happy with how these turned out. It's kind of like the icing on the cake, and it should make the tube routing and airflow a little bit better. And as always, I'll leave links down below to the exact parts that I've used. And I've got to say, this thing is so heavy already, even without like tubing or liquid or fittings or anything. Man, it's going to be an absolute brick once we get those in there. But here's a closer look of like the top radiator situation. We've got enough room for a slim XSPC rad. This is the TX240, which I've used in previous builds. And we've got enough room for a pair of full-sized 120mm fans at the top. Don't worry about the exact ones that I've used here. These will be swapped out for some Noctua 120s. And then in addition to that, we've also got another fan at the bottom here, which sits above the power supply. So 3 fans on a slim 240mm rad, that should allow for some pretty decent heat dissipation. As for the second radiator, which is also an XSPC TX240, slim fans on this one, this is where things get a little bit tricky, and honestly, it's why I haven't done a dual rad build in the T1 yet. As you can see, it's an extremely tight fit. Not only is the clearance between the fans and the GPU barely a few millimeters, but there's no mounting bracket to support it at all. From all the builds that I've seen online, people just suggest to hook up your tubing, close the side panel, and that's it. The radiator just pretty much sits there. Now, mounting the second rad is actually possible on the other side of the case, over the motherboard and the power supply. They do actually provide a bracket for you to do that, but again, from the existing builds out there that have it this way, the tube routing just looks a lot more difficult and it just doesn't look as good. And there are some other problems too. With 5 fans in this system but only 2 spare headers after I plug in the pump, I need to figure out a clean way to get them all hooked up instead of just using a bunch of Y-splitters. The top panel as well doesn't fully close with the radiator screws that I've used, so I'll need to figure out a solution for that too, and we also haven't even started with the tubing or the fittings. Having said that, this is shaping up to be a really extreme build, and I honestly can't wait to be using this as my own personal system. Like 4090 7800X3D liquid cooled in this form factor with custom cables, like, are you kidding me? That is going to be absolutely nuts.